Rebecca Martinez stared at the phone in her trembling hands, reading the message for the 7th time. The words hadn't changed, but somehow she kept hoping they would rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that didn't turn her entire world upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Your husband isn't who you think he is. Meet me at Riverside Diner tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. A friend, Rebecca had always prided herself on being logical. As a forensic accountant for the state of Colorado, she spent her days unraveling financial mysteries, following paper trails that led to the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. Numbers didn't lie. Spreadsheets told stories more honest than most people ever would. But standing in her kitchen that Tuesday evening, holding a message that challenged everything she thought she knew about her life, logic felt like a foreign concept. The phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. I know this is hard to believe, but David isn't David Martinez. His real name is Marcus Chen, and he's been running from something for the past 8 years. Rebecca's legs gave out. She sank into the chair at her kitchen table, the same table where she and David had shared breakfast just that morning. The same table where he'd kissed her forehead and told her he loved her before heading off to his job at the engineering firm downtown. The same table where they'd planned their upcoming anniversary dinner just 3 days ago. David Martinez, her husband of 6 years. The man who brought her coffee every morning exactly the way she liked it. The man who remembered her mother's birthday better than she did. The man who held her during thunderstorms because he knew they reminded her of the night her father died. Marcus Chen. The name felt foreign in her mind, like trying on clothes that belonged to someone else entirely. Her hands shook as she typed back. Who is this? How do I know you're telling the truth? The response came immediately. Check the scar on his left shoulder. Ask him how he got it. He'll tell you it was from a hiking accident in college. That's a lie. Then check the bottom drawer of his desk. In the home office, there's a loose panel in the back. Behind it, you'll find documents that will explain everything. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. The scar, she knew it well. A jagged line about 3 inches long that she'd traced with her fingers countless times during quiet Sunday mornings. David had always been vague about its origin, brushing off her questions with jokes about being clumsy or changing the subject entirely. She'd never pushed because everyone had things they preferred not to discuss, but now that casual dismissal felt different, calculated, deliberate. The home office was David's sanctuary. A small room at the back of their house where he handled their finances, worked on his personal projects, and occasionally took late-night work calls. Rebecca respected his privacy there, the same way he respected hers when she needed space to decompress after particularly challenging cases at work. Trust, they'd always said, was the foundation of their marriage. Trust. The word felt bitter now, like medicine that had gone bad. Rebecca found herself walking toward the office before she'd consciously decided to move. The door was slightly ajar, the way David always left it when he wasn't actively working inside. The evening light filtering through the window cast long shadows across his desk, making the familiar space feel somehow ominous. She'd been in this room hundreds of times. She'd helped him assemble the desk when they first moved into the house. She'd brought him sandwiches during his weekend projects. She'd even used his computer once when hers was being repaired. But now she stood in the doorway like a trespasser, afraid to enter a space that belonged to the man who might not be her husband at all. The desk was neat, organized in the way that had always impressed her. David was methodical about everything. His clothes arranged by color, his books alphabetized, his tools arranged by size and function. It was one of the things she'd fallen in love with about him. This quiet orderliness that balanced her own tendency toward creative chaos. Bottom drawer was locked. She'd noticed that before, but had never thought to question it. After all, he kept their important documents there: birth certificates, social security cards, insurance papers. Of course it would be locked. She had a similar setup in her own filing cabinet at work. But the anonymous messenger had mentioned a loose panel in the back of the drawer. How could they know such a specific detail unless they'd been in this room? Unless they'd explored this desk in ways that Rebecca herself never had? She tried the drawer handle anyway, knowing it wouldn't budge but needing to confirm what she already knew. Locked, solid, impenetrable without the key that David kept on his keychain. David's keychain. The thought struck her like a physical blow. He always kept his keys with him, even around the house. Always. She'd teased him about it before, calling him paranoid, but he'd laughed it off and said it was just a habit from growing up in the city. David had told her he was from Phoenix, Arizona. A middle child in a family of 5, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. He'd shown her pictures, a small woman, with kind eyes and graying hair, standing in front of a modest house with desert landscaping. His grandmother Elena, who had supposedly passed away 2 years before Rebecca met David. But if David wasn't David, then who was the woman in those photos? Whose grandmother had she been mourning? Whose family stories had she been hearing for 6 years? The questions multiplied in her mind like a virus, each one spawning 2 more until she felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of doubt. Every shared memory now felt suspect. Every story David had told her about his past could be fiction. Every intimate detail he'd shared could be an elaborate lie. Rebecca backed out of the office and closed the door, her breathing shallow and rapid. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to think clearly, but thinking clearly felt impossible when her entire reality was shifting beneath her feet. In the living room, she sank onto the couch that she and David had picked out together last spring. They'd spent 3 weekends visiting furniture stores, debating between leather and fabric, arguing good-naturedly about colors and styles. Finally, they'd compromised on this deep blue sectional that complemented both their tastes. It had felt like such an adult thing to do, buying furniture together, planning their shared space. But if David wasn't David, then what did any of it mean? Was she living in a house with a stranger? Sleeping next to someone whose name she didn't even know? The front door opened with the familiar sound of David's key in the lock, followed by his usual cheerful call. "Honey, I'm home. Sorry I'm late. Got stuck in a meeting that ran way over." Rebecca's chest tightened. She listened to the sounds of David's routine, keys dropping into the bowl by the door, briefcase being set down in the entryway, footsteps moving toward the kitchen. These sounds had been the soundtrack of her evenings for 6 years. Comforting. Predictable. Safe. Now they sounded like the footsteps of an intruder. "Becca, you okay? You're being awfully quiet." David appeared in the living room doorway, loosening his tie with the easy familiarity of someone completely comfortable in his space. He was still handsome at 34, with the kind of warm brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled and dark hair that he was always threatening to cut shorter, but never did because Rebecca liked running her fingers through it, looking at him. Now she searched his face for signs of deception, for cracks in whatever mask he might be wearing. But he looked exactly the same as he had that morning, tired from a long day at work, happy to be home, genuinely concerned about her unusual silence. "Just thinking about a case," she managed, the lies sliding out more easily than she'd expected. "Complex financial fraud. You know how it is." David nodded, settling onto the couch beside her with the casual intimacy of long partnership. He smelled like coffee and the cologne she'd bought him for Christmas, familiar and comforting. When he put his arm around her shoulders, she had to resist the urge to pull away. "Want to talk about it?" He asked, the same question he asked whenever she seemed troubled. Sometimes talking through the details helps you see patterns you might have missed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was David, offering to help her analyze deception and uncover hidden truths, when he might be the biggest deception in her life. The man who helped her solve financial mysteries for a living might be a mystery himself. "It's okay," she said. "I need to work through it on my own for now." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the evening news. David commented occasionally on the stories, making the same kinds of observations he always did about politics and social issues. He laughed at the weather forecast that promised more rain than Colorado had seen in months. He mentioned that his coworker Jake was thinking about proposing to his girlfriend, and asked if Rebecca thought they should offer to host an engagement party. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it had been every other evening for the past 6 years. Except that Rebecca felt like she was watching a performance, like David was playing the role of her husband while she played the role of the woman who believed him. When David excused himself to take a shower, Rebecca found herself alone with her spiraling thoughts once again. The anonymous messenger's words echoed in her mind. Check the scar on his left shoulder. Ask him how he got it. She'd never pushed David for details about the scar, but now she realized that every time the subject came up, he deflected with humor or distraction. A hiking accident, he'd said once. A fall from his bike as a kid, he'd said another time. The stories never quite matched, but she'd attributed that to the natural way memories could shift and change over time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But what if it wasn't forgetfulness? What if it was intentional misdirection? The sound of the shower running upstairs felt like a countdown timer. David would be up there for exactly 15 minutes. He was clockwork about his routines. 15 minutes to decide what she was going to do with the information she'd been given. 15 minutes to choose between confronting him directly or trying to find evidence first. Rebecca was an investigator by training and by nature. She believed in evidence, in building solid cases before making accusations. But she was also a wife who was possibly discovering that her marriage was built on lies. The professional and personal sides of her nature were at war. The shower stopped. David would be drying off, brushing his teeth, running a comb through his hair. Another 5 minutes, maybe 10, before he came back downstairs in his comfortable clothes, ready for their usual evening routine of dinner and television and the quiet intimacy of a long-married couple. Rebecca made her decision. She climbed the stairs quietly, though she wasn't sure why stealth felt necessary. At the top of the landing, she could see David through the partially open bathroom door, his reflection visible in the mirror as he brushed his teeth. His left shoulder was turned away from her, but she could see the edge of the scar that had become such a significant detail in her mind. "David?" she called softly. He turned, toothbrush still in his mouth, and smiled at her through the mirror. The expression was so genuinely warm, so completely familiar, that for a moment she wavered. This was the man she'd built a life with. The man who knew that she liked extra foam in her cappuccino, and that she couldn't sleep if there were dishes in the sink. The man who had held her hand through her father's funeral and celebrated with her when she got her promotion. How could any of that be fake? "How did you get that scar?" she asked, keeping her voice casual, conversational. David paused mid-brush, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. For just a fraction of a second, so brief she might have imagined it, something flickered across his expression. Surprise? Concern? Calculation? Then he smiled and rinsed his mouth. "The scar? You know that story. Hiking accident in college. Why?" "I was just thinking about it," Rebecca said. "You've mentioned it before, but I don't think you ever told me the whole story. What exactly happened?" David turned to face her directly, leaning against the bathroom counter with the relaxed posture of someone with nothing to hide. But Rebecca noticed that he positioned himself so the scar was facing away from her again. "It's not that interesting," he said. I was hiking with some friends in Sedona. You know how those red rocks can be tricky. I lost my footing and scraped myself pretty badly on the way down. I needed 12 stitches. The story sounded plausible. David had always been athletic, the kind of person who sought out hiking trails and rock climbing adventures. She could easily picture him taking risks on a challenging trail, but she could also hear the anonymous messenger's voice in her head. That's a lie. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have in Rebecca's hands as she sat in her car outside the Riverside Diner. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she could see the anonymous messenger. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and worried eyes, sitting alone in a corner booth. The woman had been watching the parking lot, and when she spotted Rebecca, she'd given a small nod of recognition. Rebecca's phone buzzed with another message. I can see you're hesitant. I understand. But Sarah deserves justice, and you deserve the truth. Sarah, the name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. The woman David claimed was his college girlfriend who died in a car accident. The woman whose photo Rebecca had found in that hidden compartment, along with a death certificate dated just 2 months ago, not 8 years ago as David had told her. The previous night had been a masterclass in deception. After Rebecca discovered David's real identity documents, she'd spent hours staring at them, trying to reconcile the man she'd married with Marcus Chun, a former pharmaceutical researcher who disappeared from Seattle after being accused of falsifying clinical trial data. The accusations had never been proven. The investigation closed due to lack of evidence, but the damage to his career had been irreversible. David had returned from his late night emergency at the office to find Rebecca pretending to be asleep. She'd listened to him moving around their bedroom, going through his normal bedtime routine, before sliding into bed beside her. When he'd whispered, I love you, into the darkness, she'd had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. Now sitting in the diner parking lot, Rebecca made her choice. She grabbed the folder and ran through the rain to the entrance. The woman looked up as Rebecca approached the booth, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was well-dressed but tired-looking, with the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from carrying terrible knowledge for too long. You came, the woman said softly. I wasn't sure you would. Rebecca slid into the opposite seat, keeping the folder close to her chest. Who are you? My name is Catherine Walsh. Sarah Chun was my daughter. The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through Rebecca's mind. Sarah Chun, Marcus Chun's wife. Not his college girlfriend, his wife. She died 2 months ago, Catherine continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Pancreatic cancer. She was only 31 years old. Rebecca's throat felt tight. David told me she died 8 years ago. In a car accident. Catherine's expression hardened. That's what he tells everyone, I imagine. It's easier than explaining why he abandoned his dying wife and disappeared with a new identity. The diner around them buzzed with normal lunchtime activity, servers taking orders, customers chatting over coffee, the ordinary rhythm of people going about their daily lives. But Rebecca felt suspended outside of all of it, existing in a bubble where nothing made sense anymore. Tell me everything, Rebecca said. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device. Do you mind? I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. Sarah made me promise to find him, to make sure people knew the truth about what he did. Rebecca nodded and Catherine pressed record. Marcus and Sarah met in graduate school at the University of Washington. Both of them were brilliant, Marcus in pharmaceutical research, Sarah in biomedical engineering. They got married right after graduation and moved to Seattle when Marcus got a position with Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Catherine paused to sip her coffee, her hands trembling slightly around the cup. For the first few years, everything seemed perfect. Marcus was working on breakthrough treatments for autoimmune disorders. Sarah was developing medical devices that could revolutionize patient care. They bought a house, talked about starting a family. Sarah called me every Sunday, just like she had since she was a little girl. The motherly pain in Catherine's voice was unmistakable, and Rebecca found herself thinking of her own mother, of the weekly calls that anchored her to family and history. Then Marcus's research hit problems. The clinical trials weren't going as expected. His supervisor started questioning his methodology, his data collection. There were whispers about shortcuts, about results that were too good to be true. Were the accusations justified? Rebecca asked, Catherine's mouth pressed into a thin line. Sarah believed they were. She found discrepancies in his research notes, evidence that he'd been manipulating trial results to make his treatments appear more effective than they actually were. When she confronted him, he became different, paranoid, convinced that his colleagues were sabotaging him out of jealousy. Rebecca thought about David's occasional rants about office politics, his complaints about coworkers who didn't appreciate his innovation. She'd always attributed it to normal workplace frustration, but now those complaints took on a darker significance. The investigation dragged on for months, Catherine continued. Marcus became increasingly erratic. He accused Sarah of spying on him, of working with his enemies to destroy his career. Their marriage deteriorated rapidly, but she stayed with him? Sarah loved him, Catherine said simply. Even when he was at his worst, she believed there was still good in him. She thought she could help him through whatever crisis he was having. Rebecca understood that loyalty, that desire to save someone you love from their own destructive choices. She'd felt it herself during David's darker moods, the times when he seemed haunted by something he couldn't or wouldn't share. The investigation was eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, but Marcus's reputation was destroyed. No pharmaceutical company would hire him. His research career was over. That's when he started talking about starting fresh, about leaving Seattle and everything behind. Sarah didn't want to go. Catherine shook her head. She had a good job, friends, a life she'd built. But more than that, she was starting to see who Marcus really was beneath the charming exterior. The lies, the manipulation, the complete inability to take responsibility for his mistakes. Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. David's version of events always cast him as the victim, the misunderstood genius surrounded by lesser minds who couldn't appreciate his vision. The night before Marcus disappeared, Sarah called me, Catherine continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. She was terrified. She said Marcus had been talking about people who were out to get them, about needing to protect themselves. She found a gun hidden in their bedroom and fake identity documents with different names. She didn't go with him. She refused. She told him she wouldn't run away with him and wouldn't become part of whatever new lie he was planning to build. So he left without her. Just vanished one night, taking their savings and leaving her with nothing but debt and a destroyed credit rating. The betrayal in Catherine's voice was sharp enough to cut. Rebecca could picture Sarah waking up to find herself abandoned by the man she'd loved, left to deal with the aftermath of his choices alone. That was 8 years ago, Catherine said. Sarah spent 2 years cleaning up the financial mess Marcus left behind. She eventually got back on her feet, found a new job, and started rebuilding her life. She even began dating again, though. She never remarried. She said she couldn't trust her judgment about men anymore. Rebecca winced at the parallel to her own situation. How would she ever trust anyone again after this? About 3 years ago, Sarah started having health problems. Stomach pain, weight loss, fatigue. The doctors thought it was stress-related at first. By the time they discovered the cancer, it had already spread. Catherine's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. She fought so hard. Chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments. She sold everything she owned to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. She never gave up hope, not until the very end. Did she try to contact David, Marcus, when she got sick? She hired a private investigator about a year ago. She said she wasn't looking for reconciliation or money. She just wanted closure, wanted to understand why he'd thrown away their life together. Catherine wiped her eyes with a napkin. The investigator found him living in Colorado under the name David Martinez, married to a forensic accountant named Rebecca Martinez. The words hit Rebecca like a slap. Sarah had known about her, had known that the man who'd abandoned her was living happily with someone else while she fought for her life alone. She could have exposed him, Catherine continued. Could have told you the truth, destroyed the new life he'd built, but Sarah wasn't vindictive. She said she didn't want to hurt an innocent person who was probably just as deceived as she had been. Rebecca felt sick. While she'd been building what she thought was a loving marriage, Sarah Chun had been dying alone, protecting Rebecca from a truth that might have saved them both years of heartache. So why are you telling me now? Catherine's expression hardened. With resolve. Because Sarah died believing that Marcus had learned from his mistakes, that maybe he'd become a better man with his second chance. She made me promise not to interfere with his new life unless I discovered he was hurting someone else. The implication hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. What did you discover? Catherine reached into her folder and pulled out several photographs. They showed David with a woman Rebecca didn't recognize, a petite blonde in her 30s, laughing at something he was saying as they sat together in what looked like an upscale restaurant. Her name is Jennifer Morrison. She's a nurse at Denver General Hospital. These photos were taken 3 weeks ago. Rebecca stared at the images, her vision blurring as the implications sank in. David wasn't just a man running from his past. He was actively building a future that didn't include her. There's more, Catherine said gently. She pulled out bank statements, credit reports, financial documents that Rebecca recognized as the kind of evidence she would gather in her own investigations. Marcus has been systematically draining your joint accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger withdrawals over the past 6 months. He's opened credit cards in your name, taken out loans using your information as collateral. Rebecca's professional mind kicked in, analyzing the documents with the detached expertise that had made her so successful in her career. The pattern was clear, methodical, and devastating. David had been preparing to disappear again, and this time he was taking her financial stability with him. He's planning to leave, she said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Catherine nodded. According to Jennifer's social media posts, she thinks they're planning a romantic getaway to Costa Rica next month. She's posted about needing to get her passport updated, about learning Spanish, about how excited she is for their new adventure together. Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of the deception. Not only had David Marcus built their entire relationship on lies, but he was already working on replacing her, just as he'd replaced Sarah years ago. There's something else, Catherine said softly. The private investigator kept monitoring Marcus even after Sarah died. He discovered that you're not the first person Marcus has deceived since leaving Seattle. There was a woman in Phoenix, Elena Rodriguez. He was engaged to her for almost 2 years before disappearing with her inheritance money. Elena, the name of David's fictional grandmother, the woman in the photos he'd shown Rebecca, the woman whose death he'd mourned with. Such convincing grief, Rebecca felt the last of her illusions crumble. Every story David had told her about his past had been stolen from real people, real relationships he'd destroyed. She wasn't married to David Martinez, she was married to a ghost. A carefully constructed persona built from fragments of truth and elaborate lies. What do you want me to do? Rebecca asked. Catherine leaned forward, her eyes intense. I want you to expose him. Sarah died protecting his secret, but he doesn't deserve that protection. He's going to keep doing this, keep hurting innocent people, unless someone stops him. I could go to the police, With what evidence? He hasn't technically committed any crimes that you can prove. The financial fraud would be hard to prosecute if you're married and have joint accounts. The identity theft happened 8 years ago in another state. Rebecca knew Catherine was right. Her professional experience told her that building a case against David would be nearly impossible without more concrete evidence of recent criminal activity. But there is another way, Catherine continued. Help me document everything. His patterns, his methods, his new identity. Create a record that future victims can use to protect themselves. Make sure that when he inevitably abandons Jennifer Morrison, she have the information she needs to seek justice. Rebecca looked at the photographs again, studying David's face as he smiled at another woman he was planning to deceive and abandon. The man in those images looked exactly like the man she'd fallen in love with. Charming, attentive, completely convincing in his affection. He's good at this, she said. Practice makes perfect, Catherine replied grimly. Sarah wasn't his first victim, and you won't be his last. Unless we stop him. Rebecca made her decision. Rebecca's transformation from victim to investigator began that very evening. She sat in her car outside Jennifer Morrison's apartment building in downtown Denver, watching the third-floor windows where soft yellow light indicated someone was home. The private investigator Catherine had hired, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Torres, sat in the passenger seat with a telephoto lens camera and a tablet full of surveillance equipment. She gets off her shift at Denver General at 7, Diana explained, checking her watch. Marcus usually shows up around 8:30, stays until midnight, then heads back to you. He's got his timing down to a science. Rebecca felt nauseous thinking about David's meticulous scheduling, the way he'd accounted for every hour while living a double life. All those late nights at the office, those weekend work emergencies, those business trips that now seemed questionable. In retrospect, how long have they been seeing each other? Rebecca asked. Based on Jennifer's social media history and credit card records, about 4 months. But Marcus has been laying the groundwork for longer than that. He started following her on Instagram 8 months ago, began liking her posts, leaving flirty comments, classic grooming behavior. Diana pulled up Jennifer's Instagram profile on her tablet. The woman was undeniably attractive, with bright blue eyes and an infectious smile that radiated warmth and authenticity. Her posts showed a life, full of meaningful work, close friendships, and simple pleasures, hiking trips, book clubs, volunteer work at animal shelters. She's a pediatric oncology nurse, Diana continued. Specializes in caring for children with cancer. By all accounts, she's genuinely compassionate, dedicated to helping others. Exactly the kind of person a predator like Marcus would target. Rebecca studied Jennifer's photos, searching for similarities between this woman and herself. Both were professionals in their 30s. Both had careers focused on helping others. Both seemed to value stability and genuine connection. Marcus clearly had a type, women who were successful enough to provide financial security, but caring enough to be easily manipulated. There, Diana said, pointing to a silver sedan pulling into the apartment complex's parking garage. Right. On schedule. Rebecca's stomach clenched as she recognized David's car. She watched him emerge from the vehicle, carrying a bouquet of flowers and what looked like takeout from an expensive restaurant. He moved with the confidence of a man who had every right to be there, someone arriving for a romantic evening with his girlfriend. He brings her flowers every time, Diana noted. Always from the same florist shop near your house. He's charging them to your joint credit card. The casual cruelty of it took Rebecca's breath away. David was using her money to court his next victim, literally making her pay for her own replacement. Watch David disappear into the building. 5 minutes later, lights came on in Jennifer's apartment, and through the sheer curtains, Rebecca could see 2 silhouettes embracing. I need to talk to her, Rebecca said. Diana shook her head. Not yet. If you approach her now while she's still under his influence, she won't believe you. Women in Jennifer's position always think they're different, that their love is special. Enough to change a man like Marcus. We need more evidence first. Rebecca understood the psychology, even if it frustrated her. She'd been in Jennifer's position just days ago, completely convinced of David's authenticity and devotion. The revelation of his deception had required overwhelming evidence, documents, photographs, testimonials from other victims. Anything less, and she might have dismissed it as jealousy or misunderstanding. What kind of evidence? Deanna smiled. Grimly, the kind that will make it impossible for him to deny what he is. Marcus is a creature of habit. He follows the same patterns with every woman he targets. If we can document those patterns, we can predict his next moves. Over the following weeks, Rebecca lived a strange double life. During the day, she continued her work as a forensic accountant, tracking financial crimes and building cases against white-collar criminals. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using the same skills to investigate her own husband, that she used to help other victims of fraud. At night, she became a different person entirely. She installed hidden cameras in their home office, placed GPS trackers in David's car, and monitored his phone calls using equipment Diana had provided. She documented every lie, every discrepancy, every moment when David's carefully constructed persona slipped. The most devastating discovery came when she found David's burner phone hidden in his gym bag. The device contained months of text messages between him and Jennifer, conversations that painted a picture of their relationship that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. David had told Jennifer that his wife was mentally unstable, that Rebecca suffered from paranoid delusions and violent outbursts. He claimed he was staying in the marriage out of pity and financial obligation, but that he'd found true love with Jennifer and wanted to build a real future with her. The messages revealed David's manipulation in real time. When Jennifer expressed concern about dating a married man, David reassured her that he was already consulting with divorce attorneys. When she worried about the ethics of their relationship, he painted himself as a victim trapped in an abusive marriage. Most chilling were the messages about their planned departure. David had convinced Jennifer that they needed to leave the country for a fresh start, away from Rebecca's harassment and the toxic environment of Denver. He'd convinced her to liquidate her savings, to cash in her retirement accounts, to prepare for a life of adventure in Costa Rica, where they could start over together. Rebecca recognized the pattern immediately. It was exactly what David had attempted with Sarah Chun, exactly what he'd done to Elena Rodriguez. He was preparing to disappear again, taking Jennifer's money and leaving her stranded in a foreign country with no resources and no way home. This time would be different. This time, Rebecca was prepared. She spent hours studying financial records, tracing David's methods of identity theft and money laundering. She discovered that over the past 6 months, he'd opened 17 different credit accounts using variations of her personal information. He'd taken out loans against their house, borrowed money using her professional credentials as collateral, and systematically moved funds from their joint accounts into untraceable overseas investments. The total damage was staggering, over $400,000 stolen from accounts, loans, and credit lines that Rebecca would be legally responsible for repaying. David hadn't just been planning to leave her. He'd been planning to destroy her financially in the process. Deanna helped Rebecca document everything. They photographed documents, recorded phone calls, and created a comprehensive timeline of David's criminal activities. They also reached out to other victims, building a network of women who'd been deceived by Marcus Chun across multiple states and identities. Elena Rodriguez, the woman David had defrauded in Phoenix, agreed to testify about her experience. She'd lost her inheritance, money left to her by her deceased father, when Marcus disappeared with her life savings. She'd spent years rebuilding her credit and her sense of trust, only to discover through Catherine Walsh's investigation that her former fiancé was still operating under different names. He told me the same stories, Elena explained during a video call with Rebecca and Catherine. The dead grandmother, the family tragedy, the need to start fresh together. He even showed me the same photographs that he probably showed you. Pictures he'd stolen from real families, real people whose lives he'd researched and appropriated. There was also Marie Stevens from Portland, Oregon, who discovered David's true identity when he accidentally used his Marcus Sheen credit card to pay for dinner during what she thought was their romantic weekend getaway. She'd confronted him about the discrepancy, and he'd disappeared that same night, taking her jewelry and the cash she'd been saving for her daughter's college tuition. Each woman's story followed the same devastating pattern: the whirlwind romance, the tragic backstory, the gradual financial manipulation, and finally the complete abandonment. Marcus Chen was a professional predator who'd been refining his techniques for nearly a decade, but Rebecca had advantages the other women hadn't possessed. Her background in financial investigation gave her the skills to track money trails and document evidence. Catherine Walsh's determination to honor her daughter's memory provided additional resources and connections. Most importantly, they'd identified Marcus's next target before he could complete his escape plan. The breakthrough came when Diana intercepted communications between David and a contact in Costa Rica. David had been working with a document forger named Roberto Vasquez, arranging for new identity papers that would allow him and Jennifer to disappear completely. The exchange revealed not only David's timeline for departure, but also the location where he planned to meet his contact. He's planning to leave in 3 days, Diana reported. Thursday evening flight to San Jose, connecting through Miami. He's already purchased the tickets using Jennifer's credit card. Rebecca felt time compressing around her. 3 days to finalize their evidence. 3 days to save Jennifer from financial ruin. 3 days to ensure that Marcus Chun would finally face consequences for the trail of destruction he'd left across multiple states. "What's our move?" Rebecca asked. Catherine, who'd become the unofficial leader of their group, spread documents across Rebecca's kitchen table. "We have enough evidence to alert federal authorities about the identity theft and money laundering. The FBI takes financial crimes seriously, especially when they cross state lines. But that could take months to investigate," Rebecca protested. "By then, David and Jennifer will be gone." "Not if we can prove he's actively engaged in criminal activity," Diana interjected. "The meeting with the document forger is our chance. If we can record David purchasing fraudulent identity documents, we'll have grounds for immediate arrest." The plan was risky but straightforward. Diana would conduct surveillance at the meeting location while Rebecca and Catherine alerted federal authorities. They'd coordinate the timing so that law enforcement could catch David in the act of purchasing illegal documents, providing immediate justification for arrest and preventing his escape. But Rebecca had her own additional plan, one she hadn't shared with the others. While they focused on legal justice, she intended to make sure Jennifer Morrison learned the truth before David could manipulate her into leaving the country. The night before David's planned meeting with the document forger, Rebecca made her choice. She drove to Jennifer's apartment, her car loaded with copies of every piece of evidence they'd gathered: financial records, photographs, testimonials from other victims, documentation of David's true identity and criminal history. She sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes, gathering her courage. Approaching Jennifer was a massive risk. If David discovered that Rebecca knew about their relationship, he might change his plans, disappear immediately, and escape justice entirely. But Rebecca couldn't let another innocent woman be destroyed by Marcus Chun's carefully orchestrated deceptions. Jennifer Morrison deserved the truth, even if accepting that truth would shatter her world the way it had shattered Rebecca's. Rebecca took the elevator to the 3rd floor and knocked on Jennifer's door. When it opened, she found herself face to face with the woman her husband planned to abandon and financially destroy. "Jennifer Morrison?" Rebecca asked. "Yes?" Jennifer replied, her expression curious but friendly. Up close, she was even prettier than her photograph suggested, with kind eyes and a warm smile that made Rebecca understand exactly why David had targeted her. "My name is Rebecca Martinez. I believe you know my husband. He's been calling himself David Martinez, but his real name is Marcus Chun. I need to tell you some things about him that might save your life." Jennifer's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror that Rebecca recognized all too well. They sat in Jennifer's pristine living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life carefully built, nursing certificates. On the walls, photos with friends and family, a bookshelf filled with medical journals and romance novels. It was exactly the kind of stable, authentic life that predators like Marcus targeted. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Jennifer said, for the third time, though her voice had lost its initial conviction. She held the financial documents in trembling hands, staring at bank statements that showed systematic theft from Rebecca's accounts. "David wouldn't. He's not like this." Rebecca recognized the desperate denial. She'd felt it herself just weeks ago, clinging to the fantasy that there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding that would restore the man she'd loved to the pedestal where she'd placed him. "I know how this sounds," Rebecca said gently. "I know you love him. I loved him too. That's exactly what makes him so dangerous." Jennifer set down the documents and walked to her mantelpiece, where she picked up a framed photo of herself and David laughing together at what looked like a wine-tasting event. Her fingers traced his face through the glass. "He told me you were mentally ill," Jennifer said quietly. "He said you were paranoid, delusional. He said you'd probably try to contact me with wild stories about him." The calculated cruelty of it made Rebecca's chest tighten. David had been preparing Jennifer for this exact moment, inoculating her against the truth by framing Rebecca as an unreliable narrator of her own life. "What else did he tell you about me?" Rebecca asked. Jennifer's composure cracked. "He said you were financially irresponsible, that you'd run up huge debts and blamed him for your problems. He said you'd threatened to hurt yourself if he left you." She turned back to Rebecca, tears streaming down her face. "But you seem so normal, so rational." "That's because I am normal," Rebecca said. "Just like you are. Just like Sarah Chun was, and Elena Rodriguez and Marie Stevens. Marcus preys on normal, successful, compassionate women because we're the ones who have something he can steal." Jennifer sank back onto her couch, the full weight of the deception beginning to settle over her. "The other women. You've talked to them?" Rebecca nodded and pulled out her phone, showing Jennifer the video testimonials they'd recorded. One by one, Jennifer watched as Marcus's previous victims told their stories. The same romantic manipulation, the same tragic backstory, the same systematic financial destruction. "Oh God," Jennifer whispered as Elena Rodriguez described losing her father's inheritance. "Oh God, what have I done?" "You haven't done anything wrong," Rebecca said firmly. "You fell in love with someone you thought was real. That's not a crime or a character flaw. Marcus is a professional. He's been perfecting these techniques for years." Jennifer stood up abruptly and began pacing her small living room. "The Costa Rica trip," she said, her voice rising with panic. "He convinced me to cash in my retirement accounts, said we needed liquid assets for our new life together. I gave him access to everything." Rebecca's heart sank. She'd hoped to reach Jennifer before any major financial damage had been done. But Marcus had already begun the final phase of his con. "How much?" Rebecca asked. $87,000, Jennifer said, her voice barely audible. "My entire life savings. Everything I'd worked for since nursing school." The number hit Rebecca like a physical blow. $87,000 represented years of Jennifer's life, Late-night shifts in pediatric oncology, overtime hours caring for dying children, careful saving and responsible financial planning. Marcus had convinced her to hand it all over for a fantasy future that would never exist. "We can get it back," Rebecca said, though she wasn't sure that was true. Diana Torres, the private investigator we've been working with, specializes in asset recovery. "If we can trace where Marcus moved the money, it's already gone," Jennifer interrupted. "He transferred it to an offshore account yesterday." Sighed. "It was for tax purposes to avoid complications with international banking regulations." She laughed bitterly. "I thought he was being responsible, protecting our future together." Rebecca felt rage building in her chest, not at Jennifer, but at the man who'd orchestrated this elaborate theft with such casual disregard for the lives he was destroying. Marcus hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen Jennifer's faith in love, her ability to trust her own judgment, her sense of security and hope for the future. "There's something else," Jennifer said, walking to her desk and pulling out a manila envelope. "David asked me to hold on to this for him. Said it was important business documents that needed to be kept somewhere safe." Rebecca opened the envelope and found herself staring at a complete set of identity documents for someone named Thomas Walker: driver's license, social security card, passport, birth certificate. The photo was clearly Marcus, but the address listed was in Vancouver, Canada. "He's already planning his next identity," Rebecca realized. "Thomas Walker must be his exit strategy if David Martinez gets compromised." Jennifer stared at the documents with growing horror. "How many people has he done this to?" "We've identified 5 definite victims over the past 8 years, but there could be more. Marcus is methodical about covering his tracks." Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "Target heading to meeting location early. We need to move now." "What's happening?" Jennifer asked, seeing Rebecca's expression change. "Marcus is meeting with a document forger tonight to get new identity papers for your trip to Costa Rica. We've been planning to have law enforcement arrest him during the transaction." Jennifer stood up straighter, something shifting in her expression from victim to potential ally. "I want to help." "Jennifer." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Jennifer's voice was steady now, the initial shock giving way to determined anger. "He stole my money, my trust, my future. But more than that, he's going to keep doing this to other women unless someone stops him. I won't let him destroy anyone else the way he's destroyed us." Rebecca studied Jennifer's face, seeing the same transformation she'd undergone herself, the moment when victimhood crystallized into purpose. "What do you want to do?" Jennifer walked to her closet and pulled out a small recording device. "I'm a pediatric nurse. I've had to testify in abuse cases before. I know how to document evidence." She held up the device. "I want to record him confessing. If we can get him to admit what he's done, it will be much harder for him to claim innocence later." The plan was risky, but Rebecca could see the logic. A recorded confession would provide undeniable evidence of Marcus's guilt, making prosecution much more straightforward. "How do you propose we get him to confess?" Jennifer's smile was grim. "Leave that to me. Marcus thinks I'm a naive victim who doesn't know anything about his real identity. I can use that assumption against him." They spent the next hour coordinating with Diana and Catherine, adjusting their plan to incorporate Jennifer's participation. The document forger meeting would still proceed as scheduled, with law enforcement ready to make arrests. But first, Jennifer would arrange to meet Marcus beforehand, wearing a wire and attempting to get him to reveal details about his criminal activities. At 8 o'clock that evening, Rebecca sat in Diana's surveillance van outside the Marriott Hotel downtown, watching through high-powered cameras as Jennifer approached the bar where she'd arranged to meet Marcus. Jennifer looked calm and composed, but Rebecca could see the tension in her posture. "Audio check," Diana said into her headset. Jennifer's voice came through clearly. "Testing 1, 2, 3. "Perfect." Diana confirmed. Remember, you don't need a full confession. Just get him to acknowledge using false identities or stealing. Money, anything that contradicts his innocent victim story will help. Through the camera, they watched Marcus arrive exactly on time, carrying flowers and wearing the charming smile that had deceived so many women. He kissed Jennifer on the cheek and pulled out her chair with the practiced gallantry of a man who'd performed this routine countless times. "You look beautiful tonight," Marcus said, his voice coming through Jennifer's wire clearly. "Thank you," Jennifer replied. "I wanted to talk to you about something important before we leave for Costa Rica." "Of course, darling. What's on your mind?" Rebecca gripped the edge of her seat as Jennifer began her performance. "I've been thinking about our future together, about starting fresh," Jennifer said. "It's exciting, but also a little scary. Leaving everything behind, becoming completely new people." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, a micro-expression of alertness that Rebecca recognized from her own confrontations with him. "What do you mean, new people?" "Well, you told me we'd need to be careful about our identities in Costa Rica, that your ex-wife might try to cause problems for us. I've been wondering, have you ever had to reinvent yourself before?" There was a long pause. Rebecca could practically see Marcus's mind working, trying to determine how much Jennifer knew and how much he could safely reveal. "Sometimes life requires us to make difficult choices," Marcus said carefully. "Sometimes the people we were before aren't compatible with the people we want to become." "Is that what happened in Seattle?" Jennifer asked. The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Rebecca held her breath, watching Marcus's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been resignation. "How? Do you know about Seattle?" Marcus asked quietly. "I know more than you think I do," Jennifer replied, her voice steady despite what Rebecca knew must be enormous fear. "I know about Sarah Chun. I know about the pharmaceutical research. I know about the accusations of falsifying clinical trial data." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his charming facade finally cracking to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "Who told you about that? Does it matter? The question is whether you're going to keep lying to me, or whether you're finally going to tell me the truth about who you really are." Marcus was silent for a long moment, studying Jennifer's face with the predatory focus of someone reassessing a situation that had spun beyond his control. "You want the truth?" he asked finally. "I want the truth." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it anymore. "The truth is that Sarah Chun was a naive idealist who couldn't understand that sometimes you have to bend the rules to achieve breakthrough results. The truth is that my research could have saved lives, but small-minded bureaucrats destroyed my career out of jealousy and fear. So you falsified the clinical trial data? I optimized the results to reflect the treatment's true potential," Marcus said, his voice taking on the defensive tone Rebecca remembered from his rants about office politics. "The FDA approval process is broken, designed to protect pharmaceutical companies' profits rather than advance medical science." Jennifer leaned forward. "What about the women you've deceived? Elena Rodriguez, Marie Stevens, Rebecca Martinez?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Collateral damage. Sometimes innocent people get hurt when you're fighting a corrupt system." "Collateral damage?" Jennifer's voice rose with genuine outrage. "These were women who loved you, who trusted you. You stole their money, destroyed their lives. I took what I needed to survive," Marcus interrupted. "Elena had inherited money she didn't earn. Marie was living beyond her means anyway. Rebecca was financially naive. She would have lost that money to bad investments eventually." Rebecca felt sick listening to Marcus rationalize his crimes, reducing his victims to convenient justifications for his own behavior. "And what about me?" Jennifer asked. "Am I just collateral damage too?" Marcus reached across the table and took Jennifer's hand, switching back to his manipulative charm like flipping a switch. "You're different," he said. "What we have is real. Everything else was just preparation for finding you. Jennifer pulled her hand away. You're planning to abandon me in Costa Rica, aren't you? Take my money and disappear, just like you did to the others. Of course not. I found the Thomas Walker documents, Jennifer said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at Jennifer with an expression Rebecca had never seen before. Pure, undisguised hatred. You went through my things. You were planning to steal everything I had and leave me stranded in a foreign country. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over. No, it's not, Jennifer said, standing as well. I want my money back. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that attracted stares from other patrons. Your money is already gone, Jennifer. Transferred to accounts you'll never find, in countries that don't cooperate with American law enforcement. Consider it tuition for a very expensive education in reality. You're admitting to theft. I'm admitting to being smarter than you are. Marcus snarled. You and all the other bleeding hearts who think the world owes you fairness and honesty. People like you deserve what happens to them. Jennifer stood perfectly still, letting Marcus's words hang in the air. Through the surveillance equipment, Rebecca could see other hotel guests beginning to notice the confrontation. Is that how you justify it? Jennifer asked. Telling yourself that your victims deserve what you do to them. My victims? Marcus's voice rose dangerously. I'm the victim here. I'm the one whose career was destroyed by jealous colleagues. I'm the one who's had to rebuild his life over and over because people can't handle the truth about how the world really works. The truth being that you're a pathological liar and a thief. Marcus stepped closer to Jennifer, his body language becoming threatening. The truth being that sometimes strong people have to take what they need from weak people. That's evolution, Jennifer. That's natural selection. Liana's voice crackled through the surveillance equipment. He's escalating. We need to move. But before anyone could intervene, Jennifer played her final card. You're wrong about one thing. Marcus, she said calmly, I'm not weak and I'm not alone. Marcus's expression shifted to confusion, then alarm as he noticed several people in the hotel bar, simultaneously standing up and moving toward him. Federal agents, Rebecca realized, who'd been positioned throughout the venue. Marcus Chun, one of the agents announced, displaying his badge. You're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and money laundering. The look on Marcus's face as the handcuffs clicked into place was one Rebecca would remember for the rest of her life. Shock, rage, and finally a kind of bewildered disbelief that his carefully constructed world had finally collapsed around him. The federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with nervous energy as Rebecca walked through the metal detectors for the third time in 2 weeks. The trial of Marcus Chun, the man she'd known as David Martinez, had drawn national attention, not just for the scope of his crimes, but for the unprecedented cooperation between his victims in building the prosecution's case. 6 months had passed since Marcus's arrest at the Marriott Hotel. 6 months of depositions, evidence gathering, asset recovery attempts, and the slow, methodical process of unraveling a decade of carefully constructed lies. Rebecca had learned more about criminal law in that time than she'd ever wanted to know, but she'd also discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Today was sentencing day. Rebecca took her seat in the gallery next to Jennifer Morrison, who had become an unlikely friend through their shared ordeal. Behind them sat Catherine Walsh, Elena Rodriguez, and Marie Stevens, women who had traveled from across the country to see justice served for crimes committed against them years ago. The prosecution had built an airtight case. Marcus's recorded confession to Jennifer had provided the foundation, but they'd supplemented it with financial records, digital forensics, testimony from accomplices like the document forger Roberto Vasquez, and detailed victim impact statements. That painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior spanning nearly a decade. The defense had attempted several strategies. First, they'd claimed that Marcus suffered from dissociative identity disorder, that David Martinez was a separate personality who wasn't responsible for Marcus Chin's actions. That argument had collapsed when forensic psychiatrists found no evidence of genuine mental illness, only the calculated manipulation of someone with antisocial personality disorder. Next, they'd tried to paint Marcus as a victim himself, a brilliant researcher whose career had been destroyed by jealous colleagues, forcing him into desperate measures for survival. That narrative had fallen apart under the weight of evidence showing his predatory targeting of vulnerable women and systematic theft of their assets. Finally, they'd attempted to minimize the damage, arguing that Marcus's victims were sophisticated professionals who should have been more careful with their money and their trust. That approach had backfired spectacularly when Jennifer testified about Marcus's psychological manipulation techniques, describing how he'd systematically isolated her from friends and family while convincing her to liquidate her life savings. Now, as Judge Patricia Hernandez entered the courtroom, Rebecca felt a complex mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The prosecution had requested the maximum sentence, 25 years in federal prison, but there was always uncertainty in sentencing, always the possibility that Marcus's lawyers might find some angle for leniency. Marcus himself looked different than he had during their marriage. Prison had stripped away the carefully maintained facade of success and charm. His hair was graying, his face gaunt, his posture defeated. But when he looked back at the gallery of his victims, Rebecca still saw flashes of the calculating intelligence that had made him so dangerous. "The defendant will rise," Judge Hernandez announced. Marcus stood with his attorney, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he'd worn during their marriage. Rebecca found herself studying his profile, searching for signs of remorse or recognition of the harm he'd caused. She saw neither. Judge Hernandez opened the sentencing folder with deliberate care. She was known for her thorough preparation and thoughtful approach to justice, qualities that had made her a respected figure in the federal judiciary. "Marcus Chun," she began, "you have been convicted on 17 counts of identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Before I pronounce sentence, I want to address the impact of your crimes on your victims and on society as a whole." The judge's voice carried the weight of authority as she continued. "The evidence presented during this trial reveals a pattern of predatory behavior that extends far beyond simple financial crimes. You systematically targeted women who had built successful lives through hard work and dedication. You exploited their capacity for love and trust, using their own compassion as a weapon against them." Rebecca felt tears building in her eyes as Judge Hernandez articulated the emotional dimension of Marcus's crimes, the way he'd weaponized love itself. "Sarah Chun, your first wife, died believing that she had somehow failed you, that her love hadn't been enough to save your marriage. Elena Rodriguez lost not only her inheritance but her faith in her own judgment. Marie Stevens struggled with depression and anxiety for years after you abandoned her. Jennifer Morrison cashed in her retirement savings based on your promises of a shared future that you never intended to honor." The judge turned her attention directly to Marcus, who stood impassively at the defense table. "And Rebecca Martinez lived for 6 years with a man who never existed, building a marriage on foundations that were entirely fictional. The psychological trauma inflicted on these women cannot be measured in dollars and cents, though the financial damage alone exceeds $800,000. Rebecca was surprised by how much the judge's recognition of their suffering meant to her. For months, the legal process had focused primarily on financial crimes and technical violations of federal law. But Judge Hernandez understood that Marcus's true crime had been the systematic destruction of human trust and hope. "The defense has argued that you were driven to these crimes by professional setbacks and personal desperation," Judge Hernandez continued, "but the evidence shows otherwise. You are not a victim of circumstances, Mr. Chun. You are a predator. who developed increasingly sophisticated methods of identifying, targeting, and exploiting vulnerable women. Marcus's attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that their mitigation arguments had fallen flat. The court has received victim impact statements from 5 women whose lives you've devastated, as well as letters of support from their families and friends. I have also reviewed psychological evaluations, indicating that you show no genuine remorse for your actions and pose a continuing threat to public safety. Rebecca found herself holding her breath as Judge Hernandez approached the actual sentencing. However, the court has also considered your cooperation with federal authorities in identifying other potential victims and recovering some stolen assets. Your assistance led to the arrest of 3 accomplices and the prevention of additional crimes against other women. Rebecca's stomach clenched. Marcus's cooperation with authorities had been strategic rather than remorseful, an attempt to reduce his own sentence, rather than a genuine desire to help his victims. But the legal system rewarded cooperation, regardless of its motivation. Taking all factors into consideration, Judge Hernandez announced, I hereby sentence you to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay restitution to your victims in the amount of $847,000, plus interest and penalties. 22 years, Rebecca felt a complex mix of satisfaction and disappointment. It wasn't the maximum sentence the prosecution had requested, but it meant that Marcus would be nearly 60 years old when he was released, too old to easily resume his predatory lifestyle. Furthermore, Judge Hernandez continued, you are prohibited from accessing the internet or social media during your probation period, except under direct supervision. You may not open bank accounts, obtain credit cards, or enter into romantic relationships without disclosure of your criminal history to potential partners and approval from your probation officer. The additional restrictions were more comprehensive than Rebecca had expected. They represented a recognition that Marcus's crimes weren't simply about money. They were about the systematic abuse of trust and intimacy. As the court officers prepared to escort Marcus back to prison, he turned one final time to look at the gallery where his victims sat. Rebecca met his eyes directly, refusing to look away or show any sign of intimidation. For a moment, she saw something flicker across his expression, perhaps surprise at her strength, perhaps frustration at his inability to manipulate her anymore. Then the moment passed and he was led away in shackles. Outside the courthouse, a group of women who had brought Marcus to justice gathered on the steps in the bright Colorado sunshine. Catherine Walsh embraced each of them in turn, her eyes bright with tears. Sarah would be so proud, she said. She always believed that justice would find its way, even when the rest of us had given up hope. Elena Rodriguez, who had flown in from Phoenix for the sentencing, shook her head in amazement. I never thought I'd see this day. When he disappeared, with my money, I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd just have to accept the loss and move on. None of us should have had to accept it, Marie Stevens said firmly. What Marcus did was unforgivable, and holding him accountable sends a message to other predators that there are consequences for these crimes. Jennifer, who had been quiet during the proceedings, finally spoke up. The hardest part for me isn't the money I lost. It's learning to trust my own judgment again. He made me doubt everything I thought I knew about myself. Rebecca understood exactly what Jennifer meant. The psychological aftermath of Marcus's deception had been more challenging than the financial recovery. Even with therapy and support from other survivors, she still found herself questioning her instincts about people, second-guessing her ability to recognize genuine emotion versus calculated manipulation. That's why what we did together was so important, Rebecca said. None of us could have stopped him alone, but together we were stronger than his lies. Diana Torres, the private investigator who had become instrumental in building their case, joined the group on the courthouse steps. She carried a thick folder full of documents that represented months of investigation and evidence gathering. "I wanted you all to know that the FBI has opened investigations in 3 other states based on evidence we uncovered during Marcus's case," Diana announced. "There may be additional victims we haven't identified yet, but your willingness to come forward and testify has made it possible for law enforcement to track down other crimes." The ripple effects of their justice efforts continued to expand. Rebecca realized Marcus's conviction would prevent him from hurting additional women, but it might also provide closure for victims they hadn't even met yet. As the group began to disperse, Catherine Walsh approached Rebecca privately. "I have something for you," Catherine said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Sarah left instructions in her will about what to do if Marcus was ever brought to justice. Rebecca unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound journal filled with Sarah's handwriting. The first page contained a letter addressed simply to the woman who stopped him. Sarah started writing this during her final months, Catherine explained. She wanted to leave something for whoever finally held Marcus accountable. She was too sick to pursue justice herself, but she never stopped believing that someone would. Rebecca opened the journal and read the first few lines of Sarah's letter. "If you're reading this, it means that Marcus Chun finally faced consequences for the pain he's caused. It means that someone was stronger than his lies, braver than his threats, and more determined than his manipulations. It means you refuse to let him win." The words blurred as tears filled Rebecca's eyes. Sarah Chun had died believing in justice, even when she couldn't pursue it herself. Her faith in eventual accountability had been vindicated by the courage of women she'd never met. 6 months later, Rebecca sat in her new apartment in Boulder, Colorado, reading the final entry in Sarah's journal. She'd moved away from Denver after the trial, needing distance from the places where she'd lived her fictional marriage to David Martinez. The apartment was smaller than the house she'd shared with Marcus, but it felt genuinely hers in a way that no space had since his arrest. The financial recovery had been partially successful. Federal asset forfeiture laws had allowed authorities to seize some of Marcus's hidden accounts, recovering about $300,000 that was distributed among his victims. Rebecca had received enough to pay off the fraudulent debts Marcus had created in her name and start rebuilding her credit, but the real recovery had been emotional and psychological. Rebecca had returned to work as a forensic accountant, finding renewed purpose in helping other victims of financial fraud. She'd also begun speaking at conferences about predatory romantic fraud, sharing her story to help other women recognize the warning signs of systematic manipulation. Jennifer had used her settlement money to complete additional nursing certifications, specializing in trauma counseling for abuse survivors. She'd found meaning in transforming her own victimization into tools for helping others heal. Elena Rodriguez had started a non-profit organization focused on financial literacy education for women, teaching classes on protecting assets and recognizing economic manipulation in relationships. Marie Stevens had returned to school, earning a degree in criminal justice with plans to work in victim advocacy. Each woman had found ways to transform their trauma into purpose, their pain into power. Marcus Chun had intended to destroy their lives, but instead, he'd inadvertently created a network of advocates dedicated to preventing similar crimes. Rebecca closed Sarah's journal and walked to her laptop, where she'd been working on a manuscript about her experience. The book would combine memoir with practical advice, offering both emotional support and concrete guidance for women who might be targets of romantic fraud. The title page read, "The Text That Changed Everything: Recognizing and Surviving Predatory Romance Fraud." As she began typing the final chapter, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been living a lie so complete that she hadn't even known it was fiction. Today, she was helping other women recognize and escape similar deceptions, Marcus Chun had taken 6 years of her life, stolen her trust, and shattered her faith in love. But he hadn't broken her spirit or destroyed her capacity for hope. If anything, the experience had revealed reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. The anonymous text message that had started it all now seemed like a gift rather than a catastrophe, not because the truth hadn't been painful, but because living in falsehood had been worse. Rebecca had learned that uncomfortable truths were preferable to comfortable lies, that difficult realities were more valuable than beautiful fantasies. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. "Saw your interview on the morning show. You're inspiring other women to speak up. Sarah would be proud." Rebecca smiled and typed back, "We all would be proud. We did something impossible. We stopped him." The cursor blinked on her laptop screen, waiting for her to continue writing. Rebecca took a deep breath and began typing the words that would close her story. Recovery from predatory fraud isn't about returning to who you were before. It's about discovering who you're capable of becoming after. The woman who received that first anonymous text message was naive enough to trust without questioning, vulnerable enough to love without protecting herself. The woman writing these words is wiser, stronger, and more cautious, but no less capable of love. Marcus Chun believed that trust was weakness, that compassion was vulnerability, that love was a tool for exploitation. But he was wrong. Trust, compassion, and love are sources of strength when they're grounded in wisdom and self-respect. They become dangerous only when we allow them to eclipse our judgment and silence our instincts. If you're reading this because you suspect someone in your life might not be who they claim to be, trust that instinct. If you're reading this because you've already discovered that your relationship was built on lies, know that you're not alone and that recovery is possible. If you're reading this because you want to protect yourself or someone you love from becoming a victim, remember that predators rely on shame and isolation to succeed. They count on their victims suffering in silence, too embarrassed to seek help or too afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. The text that changed everything wasn't the message that exposed Marcus's lies. It was the decision to investigate those claims rather than dismiss them. The real transformation began not when I learned the truth about my husband, but when I chose to act on that knowledge rather than pretend ignorance. Sometimes the most important message we can receive is the one that forces us to question everything we thought we knew about our lives. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is to refuse to accept convenient lies. Sometimes the text that changes everything is the one that finally tells us the truth. Rebecca saved the document and closed her laptop. Outside her window, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against the sunset, constant and reliable in a way that human relationships sometimes weren't. But that didn't mean she'd given up on human connection. It simply meant she'd learned to approach it with wisdom instead of just hope. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. For a moment, Rebecca's chest tightened with familiar anxiety. Then she read the message and smiled. "Hi Rebecca, my name is Lisa Chun, no relation. I heard your interview on NPR today and think my boyfriend might be lying about his identity. Could we talk?" Rebecca typed back immediately. "Yes, when can we meet? And whatever you do, don't confront him alone." The work continued. The truth kept spreading. And somewhere, another woman was about to discover that the most important text message she'd ever received might be the one that finally told her the truth about her life. 3 years after Marcus Chin's conviction, Rebecca Martinez sat across from Dr. Amanda Foster in a small conference room at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia. The walls were lined with case files and psychological profiles, the accumulated knowledge of decades spent studying the criminal mind. Today, they were discussing something that had never been attempted before, a comprehensive early warning system for predatory romance fraud. "Your case changed everything," Dr. Foster explained, spreading Marcus's psychological evaluation across the table. Not just because you stopped one predator, but because you documented his methods in such detail that we can now identify similar patterns in other cases. Rebecca studied the familiar documents, Marcus's meticulously planned targeting strategies, his psychological manipulation techniques, his financial crime methodologies. What had once been the tools of her own destruction had become resources for protecting other potential victims. The Bureau has been tracking romance fraud for years, Dr. Foster continued, but most cases come to our attention after the fact. When victims report financial losses, your proactive approach, identifying the predator during the active phase of his operation, that's revolutionary. The meeting had been requested by the FBI's newly formed Romance Fraud Prevention Task Force, a unit created specifically to address the growing epidemic of predatory relationship crimes. Rebecca's book had become required reading for agents training in financial crimes, and her speaking engagements had evolved from victim advocacy to expert consultation. "We want to propose something ambitious," Dr. Foster said. "A national database that tracks the behavioral patterns, identity theft techniques, and financial manipulation strategies used by convicted romance fraudsters. The goal would be to create predictive models that could help potential victims identify predators before they become victims." Rebecca leaned forward, intrigued. "How would something like that work?" "Think of it like a credit reporting system, but for romantic relationships," Dr. Foster explained. Users could input basic information about someone they're dating, name, claimed background, financial requests, and the system would flag potential inconsistencies or known fraud patterns. The concept was fascinating but complex. Rebecca could see both the potential benefits and the obvious challenges. Privacy concerns would be massive, Rebecca pointed out. And predators like Marcus are constantly evolving their techniques. By the time a pattern gets into your database, they might have already moved on to new methods. Dr. Foster nodded. Exactly the kind of insight we need from someone who's actually lived through this experience. That's why we want you to head the Civilian Advisory Board. The offer caught Rebecca off guard. Over the past 3 years, she'd rebuilt her life carefully and deliberately. She'd returned to forensic accounting, but had specialized in cases involving financial fraud against vulnerable populations. She'd completed her book, which had become a bestseller and led to speaking opportunities across the country. She'd even begun dating again, cautiously, with extensive background checks and the support of her therapist. "I'm honored," Rebecca said, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for something this large scale." "You're exactly the right person," Dr. Foster insisted. "You understand both the victim's perspective and the investigative process. You've demonstrated the ability to transform personal trauma into systemic change. And frankly, you have credibility with potential victims that law enforcement officials don't always have." Rebecca thought about Lisa Chun, the woman who'd reached out after hearing her NPR interview. Lisa's boyfriend had turned out to be a relatively minor con artist, not nearly as sophisticated as Marcus, but dangerous enough to have caused significant financial and emotional damage if Lisa hadn't trusted her instincts. Over the past 3 years, Rebecca had received hundreds of similar messages. Women who'd heard her story and recognized warning signs in their own relationships. Some turned out to be false alarms, normal relationship conflicts amplified by anxiety. But others had led to the exposure of genuine predators, including a man in Texas who'd been operating under 5 different identities simultaneously. "How many people are we talking about helping?" Rebecca asked. Dr. Foster pulled out a thick folder of statistics. Conservative estimates suggest that romance fraud affects over 200,000 Americans annually, with financial losses exceeding $1.3 billion. But those are just the reported cases. Our behavioral analysts believe the actual numbers could be 3 times higher. The scale was staggering. Rebecca had known that Marcus represented a broader problem, but she hadn't fully grasped the epidemic nature of predatory romance fraud. Most victims never report the crimes, Dr. Foster continued. They're embarrassed, they blame themselves, or they don't realize that what happened to them was actually criminal behavior rather than just a bad relationship. Rebecca understood that reluctance intimately. Even with overwhelming evidence of Marcus's crimes, she'd initially struggled with self-blame and shame. The social stigma around being deceived in romantic relationships was powerful and destructive. What would my role actually involve? Leading a team of survivor advocates, working with tech companies to develop detection algorithms, consulting on federal legislation, and most importantly, serving as the public face of fraud prevention education. The position would require Rebecca to relive her experience with Marcus repeatedly, to become permanently associated with one of the most traumatic periods of her life. But it would also provide an opportunity to transform that trauma into systematic protection for other women. I need to think about it, Rebecca said. Dr. Foster smiled. Of course. But while you're thinking, there's someone else I'd like you to meet. She led Rebecca down a hallway to another conference room, where a woman in her 40s sat reviewing case files. She looked up as they entered, and Rebecca immediately recognized her from news coverage of a high-profile romance fraud case in California. Rebecca Martinez, meet Detective Sandra Kim from the Los Angeles Police Department. Sandra has been working romance fraud cases for 8 years. Detective Kim stood and shook Rebecca's hand with a firm grip. I've read your book 3 times, she said. It's become our training manual for understanding the victim's psychological experience. Detective Kim has been pushing for exactly the kind of national coordination we're proposing, Dr. Foster explained. She's seen firsthand how predators move between jurisdictions to avoid detection. Sandra nodded grimly. We arrest someone like Marcus Chun in Los Angeles, and 3 months later, the same pattern starts showing up in Phoenix or Dallas or Seattle. These guys are nomadic by design. Local law enforcement can't keep up with them. Rebecca settled into a chair as Sandra continued. Last year alone, my unit investigated 47 cases of romance fraud. Of those, only 12 resulted in arrests, and only 5 resulted in convictions. The rest of the predators just disappeared when they realized we were onto them. What happened to the other victims? Most of them lost their life savings and never recovered financially. But the psychological damage was often worse than the monetary losses. We had 3 suicide attempts, multiple cases of severe depression, and dozens of women who became so fearful of relationships that they completely isolated themselves socially. The human cost was overwhelming. Rebecca thought about her own support network: Catherine Walsh, Jennifer Morrison, Elena Rodriguez, Marie Stevens, and how crucial their mutual support had been during recovery. Most victims didn't have that kind of community. That's another reason why your leadership would be so valuable, Sandra continued. You've demonstrated that victims can become advocates, that recovery is possible, that exposure of predators can lead to meaningful justice. Most of the women I work with have never seen a successful outcome. Rebecca was beginning to understand the scope of what they were proposing. This wasn't just about creating a database or developing new investigation techniques. They were talking about fundamentally changing how society approached predatory relationship crimes. What kind of resistance would we face? Dr. Foster and Detective Kim exchanged a meaningful look. Significant resistance, Dr. Foster admitted. Dating app companies don't want to acknowledge that their platforms are hunting grounds for predators. Financial institutions resist implementing safeguards that might inconvenience legitimate customers. And there's still a cultural tendency to blame victims for being naive or greedy. Plus, Sandra added, defense attorneys have gotten very good at arguing that romance fraud is just buyer's remorse, that women who get involved with these men are willing participants who only cry foul when the relationships don't work out as expected. Rebecca felt familiar anger rising in her chest. She'd heard similar arguments during Marcus's trial. The suggestion that sophisticated women should have been able to recognize his deception. That's exactly the kind of victim blaming that keeps people from coming forward, Rebecca said. Exactly. Dr. Foster agreed. Which is why we need someone with your credibility and communication skills to change that narrative. A knock on the conference room door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Foster's assistant entered, with a message that made her expression shift to urgency. We have a situation developing in Miami, the assistant said. Multi-victim romance fraud. Case with some unusual elements. The local FBI office is requesting immediate consultation. Dr. Foster turned to Rebecca. Would you be willing to observe how we handle an active case? It might help you understand what you'd be getting into. Rebecca found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. 20 minutes later, she was on a video conference call with FBI agents in Miami, listening to Detective Maria Santos describe a case that sounded disturbingly familiar. The suspect goes by Nathan Pierce, Detective Santos explained. But we've identified at least 3 other aliases he's used. In the past 18 months, he targets professional women in their 30s and 40s, always claims to be recently widowed, always has a tragic backstory involving a dead spouse and financial hardship. Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. The pattern was almost identical to Marcus's approach, adapted for a different geographic area and demographic. How many victims have you identified? Confirmed? 11 women across 3 states. Suspected? Possibly twice that number. The financial losses are approaching $2 million, but we think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. What makes this case unusual? Dr. Foster asked. Detective Santos paused. The suspect appears to be using social media algorithms to identify vulnerable targets. He's not just randomly selecting victims, he's using data analytics to find women who've recently gone through divorces, job losses, or family deaths. Then he's crafting personalized approaches based on their psychological profiles. The sophistication was chilling. Marcus had relied on charm and intuition to identify vulnerable women. This new predator was using technology to systematize the targeting process. We think he might be connected to a larger operation, Detective Santos continued. Possibly an organized network of romance fraudsters sharing techniques and target information. Rebecca felt the room spinning slightly. The idea that Marcus's individual predatory behavior might have evolved into organized criminal enterprises was terrifying. How can we help? Dr. Foster asked. We need victim interview protocols that can identify patterns across multiple cases. Most of these women don't realize they're part of a larger criminal operation. They think their situations are unique. Rebecca found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to participate. I can help with that, she said. I know what questions to ask and how to create an environment where victims feel safe sharing details they might be embarrassed about. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of video conferences, document reviews, and strategy sessions. Rebecca found herself drawing on 3 years of survivor advocacy experience to help FBI agents understand the psychological dynamics that made romance fraud so devastatingly effective. By the end of the day, she'd helped identify behavioral patterns that connected the Miami case to similar operations in 6 other cities. More importantly, she demonstrated to herself that her trauma could be transformed into expertise that protected other people. So, Dr. Foster said as they finally wrapped up their consultation, what do you think about heading our civilian advisory board? Rebecca looked around the conference room where the detritus of their investigative work covered every surface. Case files, psychological profiles, financial records, and victim testimonials, the raw materials of justice and prevention. 3 years ago, she'd been a naive woman living in a fictional marriage with a predatory criminal. Today, she was helping federal agents track down an organized network of romance fraudsters. The transformation felt surreal, but also inevitable. "I have some conditions," Rebecca said. Dr. Foster smiled. "I'm listening." "First, victim services and support have to be central to everything we do. Investigation and prosecution are important, but recovery and prevention are equally crucial." "Agreed." "Second, I want Jennifer Morrison as my deputy. She understands the victim experience, and she has clinical training that would be valuable for developing support protocols. We can make that work." "Third, I want a commitment that this won't just be another task force that produces reports and recommendations. I want concrete action, legislation, industry changes, public education campaigns that actually reach people." Dr. Foster extended her hand. "Deal." As Rebecca shook hands with Dr. Foster, she felt something shift inside her chest. For 3 years, she'd been defining herself in relation to what Marcus had done to her: victim, survivor, advocate. But this felt different. This felt like choosing her own identity rather than accepting one imposed by someone else's crimes. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a split second, the old anxiety returned, that reflexive fear of unknown communication that had lingered since Marcus's first deceptive contact. But this message was from Jennifer. "Saw the news about the Miami case. Are you consulting with the FBI now? Call me when you can." Rebecca smiled and typed back, "More than consulting. I think I just accepted a job that's going to change everything." Again. Some text messages destroyed lives by revealing terrible truths. Others offered hope by suggesting new possibilities. As Rebecca left the FBI building and drove toward her hotel, she reflected on how dramatically her relationship with unexpected communication had evolved. The text that had started her journey 3 years ago had exposed lies and shattered illusions. Today's conversation revealed opportunities and open possibilities. The difference wasn't in the medium of communication. It was in her capacity to handle difficult truths and make empowered choices about her future. Tomorrow, she will begin the work of building systematic defenses against predatory romance fraud. She would help other women recognize danger before it destroyed them. She would transform the expertise born from her own trauma into protection for people she'd never meet. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she was living in a fictional marriage with David Martinez, but it was a life she'd chosen consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of its challenges and possibilities. And for the first time since receiving that first anonymous text message, Rebecca felt genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. The Silicon Valley conference room buzzed with nervous tension as Rebecca faced down the executives from 3 of the nation's largest dating platforms. Across the polished mahogany table sat representatives from Love Connect, Soulmate, and Destiny Match, apps that collectively facilitated over 40 million romantic connections annually. Today's meeting would determine whether those platforms would become allies in fighting romance fraud or obstacles to meaningful reform. "Ms. Martinez," said Kevin Hutchinson, Love Connect's chief legal officer, "while we sympathize with your personal experience, we need to be realistic about the practical limitations of fraud detection. Our algorithms can't read minds or predict human behavior with perfect accuracy." Rebecca had heard similar arguments dozens of times over the past 8 months since accepting her FBI advisory role. Tech companies consistently claimed that meaningful fraud prevention was technologically impossible, while simultaneously developing sophisticated algorithms to predict everything from shopping preferences to political leanings. "Mr. Hutchinson," Rebecca replied, opening her laptop to display fraud statistics, "your platform was used by Nathan Pierce to target 11 confirmed victims in the Miami case we discussed earlier. When Detective Santos requested user data to track his activities, your company's response time was 6 weeks. By then, Pierce had already moved to a different platform and victimized 3 additional women. Jennifer Morrison, now serving as Rebecca's deputy, leaned forward with a folder of technical documentation. Over the past months, she'd become remarkably skilled at translating psychological manipulation tactics into data patterns that engineers could understand. "We're not asking you to read minds," Jennifer said. "We're asking you to recognize patterns that are already visible in your data. Users who create multiple profiles with slight variations in personal details. Accounts that systematically target recently divorced women or recent widows. Financial request patterns that escalate according to predictable timelines." Sarah Chun, Love Connect's head of user safety, shifted uncomfortably. "The privacy implications of that kind of monitoring are massive. Our users expect a certain level of confidentiality in their romantic communications." Rebecca pulled up a presentation slide showing financial losses from dating app fraud over the previous year. $1.7 billion stolen from victims who trusted your platforms to provide safe environments for finding love. How do you weigh user privacy against user safety when the status quo is enabling systematic predation? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca had learned that tech executives responded better to concrete data than emotional appeals, but she also knew that numbers alone wouldn't drive meaningful change. "Let me tell you about Margaret Chun," Rebecca continued, using a case study that Jennifer had developed for exactly these situations. Margaret was a 58-year-old teacher from Portland who'd lost her husband to cancer and decided to try online dating after 2 years of mourning. Margaret joined your platform because your marketing promised meaningful connections for mature adults seeking lasting love. She was matched with someone calling himself Robert Sterling, who claimed to be a widowed engineer dealing with his own grief. Over 6 months, Robert systematically isolated Margaret from her support network while convincing her to loan him money for various emergencies. Rebecca clicked to the next slide, showing Margaret's financial records. Margaret liquidated her teacher's pension, cashed in her late husband's life insurance policy, and took out a second mortgage on her home. She lost $340,000 to a man who was simultaneously running identical scams on 7 other women across 3 different dating platforms. Kevin Hutchinson's expression had grown increasingly uncomfortable during Rebecca's presentation. "That's obviously tragic, but preventable," Rebecca interrupted. Robert Sterling's behavioral patterns were identical across all 3 platforms. He sent the same messages to multiple women, requested money using the same sob stories, and even recycled the same photos of his supposedly deceased wife. Your platforms had all the data necessary to identify him as a predator, but you didn't have systems in place to recognize the patterns. Jennifer pulled out her tablet and showed the executives a demonstration of the fraud detection prototype that Rebecca's task force had developed with help from reformed hackers and data scientists. "This algorithm doesn't invade user privacy," Jennifer explained. "It analyzes behavioral metadata, timing patterns, message templates, photo usage, financial request frequencies, without accessing actual conversation content. When it identifies suspicious patterns, it flags accounts for human review rather than making automatic decisions." Dr. Amanda Foster, who joined the meeting via video conference from Quantico, added the federal perspective. "The FBI isn't asking dating platforms to become law enforcement agencies. We're asking for cooperation in identifying criminal activity that's already occurring on your platforms. When you facilitate financial crimes by failing to implement basic safeguards, you become part of the problem." The room fell silent as the executives absorbed the implications. Rebecca could see them calculating legal liability, public relations risks, and implementation costs. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Linda Park, Destiny Match's chief technology officer. Rebecca had been preparing for this question for months. Her proposal represented a compromise, between absolute security and practical implementation, designed to protect users without destroying the spontaneous nature of online romance. 3-tier fraud prevention, Rebecca explained. First tier, automated detection of obvious red flags like reverse image searches for profile photos, detection of copy-paste messages sent to multiple users, and flagging of accounts that request money within the first month of contact. She clicked to the next slide. Second tier, user education and empowerment. Simple tools that let users verify information about potential partners, employment verification, reverse phone number lookup, social media cross-referencing. Not mandatory, but available for users who want additional security. Third tier, rapid response protocols. When users report suspected fraud, trained specialists review cases within 24 hours instead of 6 weeks. When patterns suggest coordinated criminal activity, platforms share information with law enforcement and other dating services. Kevin Hutchinson frowned. The liability implications of proactive fraud detection could be enormous. If we implement systems to identify predators and miss someone, we could be sued by victims who assume they're protected. Rebecca had anticipated this concern. That's why we've been working with congressional representatives on federal legislation that would provide safe harbor protections for platforms that implement good faith fraud prevention measures. Companies that take reasonable steps to protect users would be protected from liability for cases they can't prevent. Dr. Foster nodded approvingly. The Victims of Romance Fraud Protection Act is currently in committee. It would create legal frameworks that encourage prevention while protecting platforms from unrealistic liability expectations. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, covering technical implementation challenges, cost estimates, and timeline considerations. By the end of the meeting, all 3 platforms had agreed to pilot programs using Rebecca's fraud detection protocols. But Rebecca knew that voluntary cooperation from dating apps was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The real challenge was changing social attitudes that blamed victims for being deceived, rather than holding predators accountable for their crimes. That evening, Rebecca sat in her hotel room, reviewing preparation materials for the next day's congressional hearing. The House Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce had invited her to testify about romance fraud prevention legislation, but she knew that some committee members remained skeptical about federal intervention in online dating. Her phone rang with a call from Catherine Walsh, who'd become a crucial ally in lobbying efforts. Sarah Chun's mother had channeled her grief into political activism, working with victim advocacy groups to push for stronger consumer protections. How did the tech meetings go? Catherine asked. Better than expected, Rebecca replied. We got provisional agreements from all 3 major platforms. But I'm worried about tomorrow's hearing. Congressman Bradley has been making statements about personal responsibility and government overreach. Catherine's voice hardened. Let him say that to Margaret Chun's face, or to any of the other victims who've lost their homes, their savings, and their hope because predators are allowed to operate freely on platforms that profit from their criminal activity. Rebecca understood Catherine's anger, but she'd learned that emotional arguments alone rarely convinced skeptical politicians. Effective advocacy required combining moral urgency with practical solutions and economic logic. I've been thinking about how to frame this, Rebecca said. Romance fraud isn't just a personal tragedy. It's an economic crime that costs taxpayers billions in bankruptcies, social services, and mental health treatment. Prevention is cheaper than dealing with the aftermath. That's exactly the kind of argument that might reach them, Catherine agreed. Politicians respond to budget implications. The next morning, Rebecca sat at the witness table in the Rayburn House office building, facing a panel of congressional representatives who would determine the fate of federal romance fraud legislation. The hearing room was packed with victims, advocates, tech industry lobbyists, and journalists covering the growing epidemic of online predatory crimes. Congressman Bradley, the subcommittee's ranking minority member, opened his questioning with skepticism barely concealed behind political courtesy. Ms. Martinez, while your personal story is certainly compelling, I'm concerned about the federal government inserting itself into the business of private romantic relationships. Shouldn't adults be responsible for protecting themselves from deception? Rebecca had prepared extensively for this exact question. Congressman Bradley, romance fraud isn't about failed relationships or poor judgment. It's about organized criminal enterprises using sophisticated psychological manipulation to steal money from law-abiding citizens. We don't tell bank robbery victims that they should have been more careful about where they kept their money. But banks are federally regulated institutions with fiduciary responsibilities, Bradley countered. Dating platforms are private businesses facilitating introductions between consenting adults. Dating platforms generate revenue by keeping users engaged on their platforms, Rebecca replied. When those platforms fail to implement basic safeguards against known criminal tactics, they're profiting from criminal activity. Federal regulation simply ensures that businesses take reasonable steps to protect their customers. Congresswoman Maria Rodriguez, the subcommittee chair, leaned forward. With a different angle, Ms. Martinez, can you explain the economic impact of romance fraud on communities and taxpayers? This was the opening Rebecca had been waiting for. Congresswoman Rodriguez, romance fraud victims lose an average of $70,000 per incident. Many victims declare bankruptcy, lose their homes, and require social services support. The ripple effects include increased healthcare costs for depression and anxiety treatment, reduced consumer spending that impacts local economies, and decreased tax revenue from people whose financial lives have been destroyed. Rebecca clicked through slides showing economic data that Jennifer had compiled with help from federal economists. Conservative estimates suggest that romance fraud costs the American economy over $5 billion annually in direct losses and indirect impacts. Prevention programs cost a fraction of that amount. Congressman Bradley wasn't convinced. But how do we prevent these crimes without creating a surveillance state that monitors every online interaction between romantic partners? The same way we prevent credit card fraud without monitoring every purchase, Rebecca responded. We use pattern recognition to identify suspicious activity, investigate potential crimes, and prosecute criminals when evidence supports charges. The legislation we're proposing doesn't monitor romantic conversations. It requires platforms to implement basic safeguards against known criminal techniques. The hearing continued for 3 hours with testimony from tech industry representatives, law enforcement officials, and other victim advocates. By the end of the session, Rebecca felt cautiously optimistic about the legislation's prospects, but the real test came 2 weeks later, when she received a call from Detective Sandra Kim in Los Angeles. "Rebecca, we've got a situation," Sandra said without preamble. "The Miami romance fraud network we've been tracking, it's bigger than we thought. We've identified connections to similar operations in 12 states and 3 countries. Rebecca felt her stomach drop. "How big are we talking?" "Potentially hundreds of victims, millions in losses, and what appears to be a sophisticated criminal organization with specialized roles. Researchers who identify vulnerable targets, writers who craft personalized deception campaigns, and money launderers who move stolen funds offshore." The scope was overwhelming. What had started as individual predators like Marcus Chun had evolved into organized criminal enterprises with international reach. "What do you need from us?" "Everything," Sandra replied. "Victim interview protocols, behavioral analysis, financial tracking systems, and coordination with federal agencies. This is beyond anything local law enforcement can handle alone." Rebecca looked at her calendar, which was already packed with congressional meetings, tech company consultations, and victim advocacy commitments. But this was exactly why she'd accepted the FBI advisory role, to help build systems that could address romance fraud at scale. "We'll be there," Rebecca said. "Whatever you need." As she hung up the phone, Rebecca reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that first anonymous text message. She'd gone from victim to survivor, to advocate to federal consultant, to congressional witness. Each transformation had felt impossible until it became inevitable. But this new challenge felt different. International criminal organizations with systematic approaches to predatory fraud represented a level of sophistication that required corresponding sophistication in response. It would require coordination between federal agencies, cooperation from international law enforcement, and legislation that crossed traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Rebecca opened her laptop and began drafting an urgent memo to Dr. Foster. At the FBI, the war against romance fraud was escalating, and they needed to escalate their response accordingly. The text that had changed everything 3 years ago was just the beginning. The real work was just getting started. 5 years after that first devastating text message, Rebecca Martinez stood at the podium of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, Austria, addressing an international summit on transnational romance fraud. The audience included law enforcement officials from 43 countries, representatives from major tech companies, and survivor advocates from around the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca began, "romance fraud has evolved from individual crimes of opportunity into sophisticated international criminal enterprises. Today, I want to share what we've learned about dismantling these networks and protecting future victims." In the audience, she spotted familiar faces that represented her remarkable journey. Jennifer Morrison sat in the front row, now serving as Director of Victim Services for the International Romance Fraud Prevention Coalition. Catherine Walsh had flown in from Colorado, where she'd established the Sarah Chun Foundation for Romance Fraud Education. Even Detective Sandra Kim was present, representing the newly formed Global Romance Fraud Task Force. 18 months ago, our investigation into the Miami network led to the largest romance fraud prosecution in history, Rebecca continued. Operation Heartbreak resulted in 127 arrests across 15 countries, the recovery of $78 million in stolen assets, and the identification of over 2,000 victims worldwide. The numbers still amazed her. What had started with her personal quest for justice had grown into a global movement that had fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached predatory relationship crimes. But our greatest success isn't measured in arrests or asset recovery, Rebecca said, clicking to her next slide. It's measured in prevention. Since implementing coordinated fraud detection protocols across major dating platforms, we've seen a 67% reduction in reported romance fraud cases and an 84% improvement in victim recovery outcomes. The transformation had been neither quick nor easy. The legislative battle had taken 2 years, with fierce resistance from tech companies concerned about liability and conservatives worried about government overreach. But persistence had paid off. The Victims of Romance Fraud Protection Act had passed with bipartisan support, creating the legal framework necessary for meaningful prevention efforts. The key breakthrough, Rebecca explained, was recognizing that romance fraud prevention requires the same coordinated approach we use for terrorism prevention or money laundering. Individual agencies working in isolation cannot address crimes that cross multiple jurisdictions and platforms. She shared the story of Maria Santos, a recent victory that illustrated how far their prevention systems had evolved. Maria, a nurse from Phoenix, had been targeted by someone calling himself David Thompson. But unlike Rebecca's experience with Marcus Chun, Maria's case had been identified within 72 hours through automated detection systems. David Thompson exhibited classic predatory patterns, Rebecca explained. Rapid romantic escalation, tragic backstory, financial emergency requests, But this time, our systems were ready. The dating platform flagged his account, law enforcement was notified immediately, and Maria was contacted by victim advocates before she suffered any financial losses. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause. It was exactly the kind of proactive protection that Rebecca had dreamed about during those dark months of discovering Marcus's deception. David Thompson turned out to be Miguel Rodriguez, a member of an international fraud ring operating from Romania. His arrest led to the dismantling of an operation that had been targeting women across North America and Europe. Because we caught him early, 15 other potential victims were protected from financial and emotional devastation. Rebecca paused, looking out at the diverse audience of people who joined the fight against predatory fraud. But I want to be clear about something. Technology alone doesn't solve this problem. The most sophisticated detection algorithm in the world can't replace human judgment, intuition, and the courage to trust uncomfortable instincts. She shared one final story, her own evolution from victim to advocate to international expert. 5 years ago, I received an anonymous text message that shattered my world but ultimately saved my life. That message forced me to confront the fact that the man I'd married was a professional predator who'd built our entire relationship on lies. The personal revelation still felt vulnerable to share, but Rebecca had learned that her individual story resonated with audiences in ways that statistics and policy proposals never could. The hardest part wasn't learning the truth about Marcus Chun, she continued. It was learning to trust myself again, to believe that my instincts were reliable, that my capacity for love wasn't a weakness to be exploited, but a strength to be protected. She clicked to her final slide, which showed a network diagram illustrating the global coalition they'd built to fight romance fraud. Law enforcement agencies, tech companies, victim advocacy groups, legislative bodies, and international organizations, all connected by shared commitment to prevention and justice. Today, victims of romance fraud don't have to suffer in isolation or silence. They have access to rapid response teams, asset recovery specialists, therapeutic support, and legal advocacy. More importantly, they have proof that recovery is possible, and that their trauma can become a source of strength for protecting others. As Rebecca concluded her presentation, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who'd stood in her kitchen 5 years ago, reading that first devastating text message, could never have imagined that her personal nightmare would evolve into international expertise that protected thousands of potential victims. Her phone buzzed with a message as she left the podium. For a split second, the old anxiety flickered, that learned response to unexpected communication that probably would never completely disappear. But the message was from her fiancé, Dr. James Wilson, a cybersecurity expert she'd met through her advocacy work. Watched your speech online. You're changing the world, and I'm proud to be part of your life. Dinner when you get back to celebrate the Vienna Protocols. Rebecca smiled, thinking about how different this relationship felt from her marriage to Marcus. James knew her complete history, understood her trauma, and supported her mission without trying to diminish or control her independence. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on transparency and mutual respect rather than whirlwind romance and manufactured intensity. The Vienna Protocols, formal agreements between 43 countries to coordinate romance fraud prevention and prosecution, represented the culmination of years of advocacy work. But more than that, they represented proof that individual trauma could be transformed into systemic change when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Walking through the Vienna airport toward her flight home, Rebecca encountered a young woman crying quietly in the departure lounge. Something about her body language triggered Rebecca's now finely tuned instincts about people in crisis. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked gently. The woman looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I just found out that my boyfriend isn't who he said he was." I sent him money for his daughter's medical emergency, but the daughter doesn't exist. Nothing he told me was true. Rebecca sat down beside her, recognizing the familiar devastation of someone whose world had just collapsed. What's your name? Lisa Park. I feel so stupid. Everyone's going to say I should have known better. Lisa, Rebecca said firmly, you're not stupid. You're the victim of a professional criminal who specializes in exploiting people's capacity for love and compassion. That's not a character flaw. It's evidence that you're a caring person who trusted someone who didn't deserve that trust. She pulled out her phone and showed Lisa the contact information for the International Romance Fraud Victim Support Network, a 24/7 helpline that Jennifer Morrison had established. These people understand exactly what you're going through, Rebecca explained. They can help you report the crime, recover your assets if possible, and connect you with therapeutic support. Most importantly, they can help you understand that this wasn't your fault and that recovery is possible. Lisa stared at the information through her tears. Have you helped other people like me? Rebecca smiled. I am people like you. 5 years ago, I discovered that my husband of 6 years was a professional con artist who built our entire marriage on lies. It nearly destroyed me, but it also led me to a life I never could have imagined, one where I get to help other people avoid the pain I experienced. As Rebecca's flight was called for boarding, she gave Lisa her personal card. Text me when you get home safely. Let me know how you're doing. And remember, the person who did this to you is the criminal. You're just someone who had the courage to love, and that's never something to be ashamed of. Settling into her airplane seat, Rebecca opened her laptop to review notes for the congressional briefing she'd be giving the following week. The fight against romance fraud would never be completely won. Predators would continue evolving their techniques. New technologies would create new vulnerabilities, and there would always be people willing to exploit others' need for love and connection. But the world was safer now than it had been 5 years ago. Victims had resources and support systems that hadn't existed before. Law enforcement agencies had tools and training that made prosecution more likely. And perhaps most importantly, society was beginning to understand that romance fraud wasn't about personal weakness or poor judgment. It was about professional criminals who needed to be stopped. Rebecca's phone buzzed, with one final message as the plane prepared for takeoff. An unknown number with a familiar request. Hi, Ms. Martinez. My name is Rachel Chun. I think I might be dating someone who isn't who he claims to be. Can you help me? Rebecca typed back immediately. Yes, you're not alone. And this isn't your fault. Let's talk when I land. The text that had changed everything 5 years ago had been the beginning of a story that was still being written. Each new victim who found the courage to reach out, each predator who was stopped before completing their crimes, each law that was passed to protect potential targets, all of it was part of the same continuing narrative of transforming personal trauma into collective protection. As the plane lifted off from Vienna, carrying her back to a life she'd built deliberately and authentically, Rebecca reflected on the profound irony of her journey. Marcus Chun had intended to destroy her life by stealing her money, her trust, and her sense of reality. Instead, his crimes had led her to discover reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed and a purpose she never could have imagined. Anonymous text message that had shattered her world had ultimately saved not just her own life, but the lives of thousands of people she'd never meet. Sometimes the most devastating communications turned out to be the most important gifts we'd ever receive. The story that had begun with deception, betrayal, and heartbreak was ending with justice, purpose, and hope. And somewhere below the clouds, another woman was about to receive a message that would change everything. But this time, she wouldn't face it alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.